So what we would like to discuss today and debate is study programs and teaching COVID-19 as a game changer. And that may be also debatable, yeah? Is it a game changer? One interesting thing is we are all forced towards online teaching, whether we like it or not. And if I take the Leuphana example, so Leuphana was never designed to be like an online school, but in March, we actually had to transform into an online school because that was the only possibility how we could actually offer our teaching services. And what we would like to discuss now is, since we had the last half a year, and of course, some of you have even much longer experience with online teaching or distance teaching, what are we going to do with this experience? And in fact, there are perhaps a couple of interesting questions that we may address. And one thing that I like very much about our panel is we have representatives from universities that are responsible for designing teaching programs, but we also have two members that actually have more like an outside look, like Cassie from the OECD. We will see what your outside look is on how we can actually produce interesting study programs, but we also have the World Health Organization, and taking the pandemic into account. So what better organization we could have here on the panel to think about the demand side, yeah, of what we are trying to do. So just to keep it very briefly, what I would like to do is, unless you want to do it, Jim, yeah, to introduce the panel members, yeah. Would you like to do it? You have to unmute yourself.
I was going to suggest that we'll introduce everybody as we go along.
Perfect.
And if maybe you take the floor and just spend a little time talking about some of the issues you want to raise, and we move along, and I'll introduce everybody as we move along.
Okay, so when I think about like COVID-19 as a game changer, yeah, then there are probably a couple of dimensions that are probably of interest. Yeah, one thing is, of course, for those of you who are interested in digital platforms and tools, so in how far we can actually use digital platforms and tools to support new ways of teaching, yeah, more personalized teaching, better interaction, and all these things, and also orchestrate a globally distributed, let's say, workforce of instructors and teachers, but also of students that we can actually engage through these platforms. Then, as I'm like a strategist researcher or organizational studies researcher, I'm also interested in under what conditions are organizations like universities more likely to adopt some of these challenges or take it as an opportunity instead of simply taking it as a threat, something I'm trying to address a little bit later. And I have to actually switch off my Outlook, I'm sorry, yeah. And then last but not least, there are certainly regulatory changes and challenges. And I'm not quite sure how well we have translated this into regulatory changes, but these are certainly questions we may also address. So we start perhaps with the first person. Andrea, would you like to present yourself a little bit? Andrea is Vice President for Teaching and Learning and Equal Opportunities and Director of the Diversity Institute from Georg August University in Göttingen. And Andrea Bührmann is like an expert in the field of organizing, teaching and learning. Yeah. And of course, I would be also interested in what are you doing in Göttingen? And then the floor is yours, yeah?
Yes, thanks a lot. And I'm very happy to be part of this distinguished panel with a lot of experts. Of course, since March, I become expert of digitization in studying and learning, and I have some ideas about what is going on according to questions of diversity during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think this is very important to have both things, digitization and diversity questions. And I'm also a researcher on diversity, so and I'm a sociologist, and you will I think you can find this in my keynote. I'm expected to give the input now, or should everyone introduce himself?
Probably it would be best if we go along to save up a little bit time, so that you would give your keynote, and if this is agreeable with Jim, that the next person is doing the keynote, and then we will have the discussion afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We just have to keep some of the 10 minutes, otherwise we wouldn't have much discussion time afterwards. Would that be okay?
Of course. So I think COVID-19 can be a game changer for the good or the worse, seen from a perspective of diversity and equal opportunities. In Germany and in Europe, there are several surveys made, and I refer to the results of this survey according to the questions of diversity and inclusion. The results can be interpreted as if the universities had succeeded in overcoming the challenges of the pandemic despite some difficulties. There is, for instance, currently no empirical evidence of an increase due to the study abandonment in Lower Saxony. I think this is very, very interesting. Or the universities in Lower Saxony did their work very well. At the same time, it becomes visible in many areas that the pandemic is intensifying existing inequalities, for example, with regard to the labor market, economic inequality, compatibility of gainful employment and responsibility for care and nursing, domestic violence, barrier-free access to information and communication, and other forms of discrimination. One can suggest that COVID-19 may have such aggravating effects on existing imbalances at universities as well. An actual worsening of existing inequalities may occur through tendencies by which important concerns of diversity and equal opportunities are fading into the background of the troubleshooting mode into which universities have moved, or may become simply a casualty of cost cuts. And in Lower Saxony, we learned today, there are more cost cuts than we had before. Here we are all called upon to make use of ongoing transformations and to create space in the ad hoc digitization for the realization and preservation of diversity and equal opportunities and the reduction of risk of discrimination. For example, making sure that studying and working arrangements are flexible as possible, giving staff and students a clear signal as how to deal with any delays that occur in a way that the disadvantages are minimized for the students, making sure that deadlines and contracts are extended and communicating this, advocating political solutions at state and federal level, ensuring good technical conditions for all, including accessibility, and ensuring a non-discriminatory use of digital spaces that respects privacy and autonomy, taking equal opportunities and protection against discrimination into account in new regulations, involving equal opportunities officers, student bodies, staff council, and disabled persons representatives, as well as interest groups, specialist departments, and I think this is very important to involve all the representatives of the cities where the universities are located, and offering training and qualification opportunities on diversity issues for university teachers and staff members. In recent months, most of us has experienced a steep learning curve with regard to our own digital skills and competencies. It would be great to continue this development and incorporate aspects of diversity and equal opportunity as a cross-section into it. The digital skills that we acquire now and that are so important for our society and especially for our scientific and academic activities could thus quite naturally also be conceived as skills of accessibility, diversity competence, and protection against discrimination. If we succeed in implementing diversity and equity as cross-cutting traits in all our actions, especially in the digitization of teaching, studying, research, and management of universities, then I think COVID-19 would really be a game changer in a good way. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. So if this is agreeable with Jim, then we would move first to the second presenter.
Yeah. We should go to Neville now. Neville Wiley, Vice Principal at Stirling University in Scotland. Neville, you're welcome.
Super. I have a different list, but we follow your list. That's perfect. Neville, it's your turn.
Marcus, everybody, thank you very much indeed. I have the same list as you do, Marcus, so I thought I had a bit more time. But look, first of all, can I thank ICAS for the invitation. I thought it was rather odd actually being asked by Jim, Professor of Education and Leadership, to comment on this topic, given that I'm a mere historian, not a sociologist, and a mere associate deputy principal for internationalization rather than education, teaching and learning. However, I think all our universities, senior management, will have got used to wrestling with the issues of study programs and teaching over the last 6 months, 8 months. And so just as I have become an expert on how to charter planes to bring students from China, I have likewise become something of an expert on teaching and learning. And I mean, interestingly, Andrea, the issue of EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion, which is actually the subject that I wanted really to pick up on today. So there's, like most businesses, we horizon scan for threats, disruption on the horizon that affect our business models and our work practices and so forth. And it's rather odd that I think that the focus of most businesses was on the disruptive effects of AI, deep learning, robotics and so forth. And yet ultimately it was a rather prosaic and nasty little bug that got us, just as it had 100 years ago when it affected the war-weary world, and particularly Europe, of 1919. I think the idea of COVID being a game changer is much more, has much more purchase if we think of it as part of a broader set of disruptive changes, aggravating or accelerating what was already underway. And that shift then to online or digitally enhanced learning has been something that's been going on slowly for some time. I recall in the summer of 2018 attending a workshop run by KPMG, the management consultants, that like many other firms were trying to assist universities in a digital transformation. And asking us to imagine digital processes that would enhance what we do and transform the learning experience of our students. So there's no doubt that COVID can and has been very liberating, almost inspiring. I think we've all been slightly surprised, relieved at how agile our institutions have been, that staff, the students, the processes and so forth, in responding to the challenge of teaching online, pivoting very quickly, I mean almost over a week if I recall, to teaching online. And that's worked remarkably smoothly, I think, all things considered, and I think it's demonstrated resilience in our institutions, but also confidence that we can respond to challenges in the future. There's also been an experience over the last 3 to 6 months of actually living and experiencing a way of working that we really only had the faintest idea about only a few short months ago. this idea of a fully online learning, but also glimpsing a future of getting the benefits of that online world and integrating it into a blended form. A report published earlier this month by JISC, which is the sector-wide agency in the UK supporting institutions with edutech, provided an image of teaching in 2030 that was very much about blended opportunities, allowing our universities to get the best of face-to-face delivery as well as online learning. Now, it's immediately appealing and attractive at a number of different levels in terms of the flexibility. It offers our students new ways of learning and so forth. It's a sort of new and improved normal rather than just a new normal that I think is so tantalizing. But I am worried, and a bit like Andrea, I think, in three areas that this new, enhanced, improved normal may bring for us. And the first is that on our working practice. There's undoubted benefits that blended or online platforms can deliver for teaching. Our students can decide where they learn as much as when they learn and what they learn. There's been concomitant opportunities for us to shake up how we teach, what we teach, the way we teach it, the structures and so forth. But so much of this depends on our ability to embrace home working, home learning. The British Telecom did some research recently that demonstrated that our productivity from working at home is 20% greater than if we work in offices. The same research suggested, though, that under lockdown over the last 6 months, we've all worked about 48 minutes longer per day than we did before that. So I think the challenges really that we face currently is the problem of how our students and our staff learn to operate in this digital environment without burning themselves out. There's no question that certainly the last couple of weeks in this term have seen students and staff burning out in a way that, frankly, we could have anticipated, given the experience that our counterparts in Australia and New Zealand have experienced. So I think one of the challenges we have are actually ensuring that our staff don't overwork in this new conditions. If you can work anywhere at any time, surely there's a danger of managing those work-life balances and the mental health issues that are part of that. There's a second point, and it echoes what Andrea mentioned, it is the sort of gendered aspect of this. We know very clearly on the research side that life under lockdown, the university opportunities under lockdown, had a dramatically damaging effect on the ability of our female colleagues in the research space. So the progress that we'd made in increasing, for instance, the proportion of female scholars who were first authors on academic papers, that was hovering about 30 to 35% before the pandemic, quickly slumped to about a quarter, about 20 to 25%, within a matter of months of the pandemic striking through. And that affected certain disciplines and certain countries worse than others. Now, it's not inconceivable, it seems to me, that this gendered influence can be seen in other areas, especially when it has the capacity to reinforce traditional conceptions of gender work practices, roles and responsibilities. There's a question that flexibility brought about by the digital revolution will result in forcing, say, home care responsibilities and other gendered work practices onto the shoulders of our female colleagues in a way that would be very perverse and pernicious. And thirdly, the third kind of flag I would just put up here is the global dimension. The JISC report kind of lauded this vision of 2030 and said to the UK sector that this was an opportunity for the UK sector to secure competitive advantage from other higher education sectors. The report drew on the experience of online education in Australasia, in North America and Europe. What it didn't do was assess how that drive to technology enhanced education might exacerbate existing structural inequalities in the global higher education landscape. The JISC report suggested that UK universities had spent about £1 million to £3 million on pivoting into that digital space over the last 6 months. It's clear that for most parts of the world, that kind of investment was simply not possible. The university partners that I'm most intimately involved with in Latin America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, put in heroic efforts to shift their teaching and research online. But they struggled both in terms of the access to resources, bandwidth, and basic pedagogies. So they're really being pushing them onto the back foot. We talk about a digital poverty in the UK. The Office for Students had a survey in September that suggested that 52% of students in the UK felt that their learning had been impacted by slow and unreliable internet connections, and a further 18% for want of access to computers and laptops and so forth. This can be resolved because we've got the resources to resolve it, but that's clearly not the point and clearly not the opportunity for those in the global south. So I think, and even you know, in the UK, you know, we struggle to get our learning materials to our students who were remaining in China and wanted to continue their studies with us online before joining us later in the semester because of the Great Firewall in China. But anybody involved in partners in the global south will realize that the fragility of a lot of the systems that they're operating with. So COVID-19 can clearly be a game changer. We are particularly because it's riding the wave of those broader technological developments that will have a profound effect on all aspects of our lives. I hear that from another historian that the changes to work practices we've seen over the last 6 to 8 months have been as profound as the changes to work practices, any changes to work practices we've seen since the onset of the first industrial revolution. As COVID accelerates our headlong embrace of the so-called fourth industrial revolutions with AI, robotics, deep learning, and so forth, there will be winners and losers. And it's incumbent upon us, I think, to ensure that the siren calls of blended learning and technologically assisted and enhanced education doesn't deafen us to those who are less well positioned, less well equipped, and less well resourced to make that journey with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neville. That was very interesting, many interesting compatible thoughts. Yeah, maybe I just continue my list and Neville's list. Yeah, potentially. So it would be Maura Fischbacher-Smith, who's Vice Principal of Learning and Teaching and Professor in Public Management from the University of Glasgow. Would you be ready to take the turn, Maura?
I would, indeed. Yes, hello everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this experience.
It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. So I thought I would reflect on a few things that have happened at Glasgow in response to COVID and use them to then build on what I think some of the challenges might be ahead. I have taken a slightly different tone to the previous two speakers, but I think that what they've said underlies a lot of the things that we need to think about when we make the changes that at Glasgow, certainly, that I'm going to try and outline. So yes, I'm the Vice Principal for Learning and Teaching in the university, so very much thinking at the moment not just about how we've responded, but what this means for learning and teaching in the future. We're at a point in time where we were just developing our new learning and teaching strategy when we were going into lockdown. So for me, thinking about how we build on what has been good about the response to COVID, but really respond to a lot of the challenges around inclusion and the impact on staff, particularly working from home, is very much in my mind at the moment. Perhaps just a little bit of context. So when we went into lockdown, the timing of that for us was the same as it was for Neville. We had 2 weeks of teaching left, probably the same for you, and 6 weeks until exams, and very few members of staff had experience of teaching online. Everyone was used to our virtual learning environment, but for many people that was pretty much it. And certainly no online assessment at any scale whatsoever. So there were big changes for us. But I think I'd like to share a few things that emerged from that time that I think give me a lot of confidence and that I think we can build on, and that are particularly important when staff feel quite tired and working from home is quite difficult. And when we're aware that there are still many changes ahead because of the global impact of the pandemic. So I think the first thing that I wanted to draw attention to really was that, you know, the newness of what we were doing, the impact of having to change so many ways of working meant that actually a lot of staff were actively seeking support and professional development. And it's not something we always find particularly easy to engage people with. They're often busy. Continuing professional development is not always at the top of their list of things to do. But what it's meant we were able to do was really look at educational development alongside skills training. So many people were very preoccupied with how do I get the technology to work, but we tried to build into that, what's the educational purpose behind what you're trying to achieve and how might the technology support you in doing that. And people really did actively seek out development opportunities, and we had an awful lot of engagement with the support and development that was available. So for me, there's a real opportunity to tie that into our thinking and our developments around more active and blended learning for the future, which we were trying to do anyway, but make sure it's educationally led and not technology led. I think there's a real danger at the moment that it becomes all about the technology, and I think that exacerbates the challenges for students in particular who don't have the same access to technology that everybody else might be perceived to have. And also I think making sure that what we're doing now can be embedded meaningfully beyond COVID. There's absolutely no value in making change for a season and then not actually really making advances beyond that. I think the other thing that's made a big difference actually is peer support and shared problem solving. I've seen really a kind of mushroom in the amount of support across the institution. So we had quite a nervousness, I would say, at the start about would our learning technologists, who are relatively small in number as a ratio to our wider academic and student community, how would they cope with the demand? And actually what we've seen is that rapid shift to using collaborative tools like Microsoft Teams has actually enabled us to see just how many people can answer the problems that their colleagues have. And an awful lot of sharing of solutions, a lot of sharing of approaches that I think really built staff confidence in terms of what they need to do, and also helping people to realise that actually interaction with students and helping them feel that they belong and really making that personal connection is above all more important than anything sophisticated you can do with technology. And I think that's been a really important lesson for us. And I think it's also helped to increase the impactfulness of the support and development that we have managed to bring in for staff. I think it's also shown us the value of our whole staff population, from the teaching assistants, the PhD students who've been amazing at creating online resources, right the way through to the specialists. Everyone's had a part to play and it's been very visible. And I think we really want to, it's helped us accelerate our changes, but I think it's a way of connecting as a community that we want to continue to build on. And then I think the other thing that's been really important is in a large organisation with 30,000 students and 7,000 staff, being able to adapt and change quickly isn't something we found easy in the past, but actually, being able to prepare for 40,000 exams within 6 weeks' time and being able to do that, we changed our policies, we changed our IT support structures, we changed our student support, we changed guidance for students. I mean, you will all be the same. I think the confidence that we've had as an institution and being able to do that and do that well and do that in a way that we had more student engagement in exams than we would have if they were on campus. It's been a much more inclusive process. I think these are really important experiences for us to build on as well. In terms of what next, I think there is an opportunity and a responsibility not to just default to what we did before and go back, even although sometimes it feels tempting to go back to what's familiar. And I think just to highlight briefly three areas, I could have picked 10, but I picked 3 for brevity that I think we want to focus on. One is, how do we make the best use of face-to-face time and space when we are able to go back on campus, but equally, how do we maximise the value of that online space as well? It's not just all about the campus space, but how do we really make sure we use physical space to support student wellbeing and staff wellbeing? Often social connections are diminished because there's pressure for space for teaching staff and students, but actually, how do we make those connections meaningful and allow people to innovate and be creative if we can be more creative about our online spaces? And if we can be more adaptable and do more online, what does that allow us to do in the future? Well, I think it allows us to support students who have caring responsibilities far better. If they can do more of their study online or at a time that suits them, being rigid about our timetables on campus can be really restricting for them. I think if we have more online provision in a campus-based experience, students can take courses from other institutions. Take courses from other institutions as part of their curriculum, but we can open up our courses to students from other institutions as part of their curriculum much more easily than we have done in the past. It doesn't tie us in the same way. And for students who can't afford to travel or have responsibilities that don't enable them to travel, having a much more connected online relationships with our partners, that's an illustration today. We've got U21 partners and others. We can create curricula that students can take online, and that really broadens their horizons even if they can't leave their home country. So I think there are some real opportunities if we think about them carefully and thoughtfully, and we fund them properly for students so that they're not left out. And then I think that also requires a different staffing model. We have a very much a kind of lecturer to students and then tutor to students in tutorials, but actually could we think more creatively about team approaches to learning? We've all seen how vulnerable we are if one member of staff can't teach a course online, it just can't run. So how can we bring in other skills, learning support skills into a class, teaching assistants, and a lot more peer supported activity? And I think the disruption is allowing us to think more creatively about some of these opportunities. And with that comes a serious commitment to professional educational development and skills development for students and for staff. And then finally, I think assessment. It's very easy to focus all of our attention on learning and teaching, but actually, if all we do is default to online exams, we'll have a big debate about proctoring, and I don't think that's really where anybody wants to go. Here's a time where we need to think differently about assessment. What are we really trying to demonstrate, and how do we do that differently in an online setting? And what does rethinking online education mean for how we can then rethink on-campus education? So these are the questions and the challenges I think that we're setting ourselves, and we have a big conversation starting about inclusive assessment. I think 24-hour exams are something we've tried this year because of the pandemic, and many people are now actually not going back to time-limited exams on campus, and that again makes it much more inclusive for students and students who would otherwise have to have special adjustments. So is COVID-19 a game changer? Well, I certainly think it has been in terms of how we work, and I think it's accelerated many of the changes we've been thinking about introducing in any case, but we're a little bit more pilot form. But whether it's an enduring game changer, I think, to be honest, will be determined in just the next few months. Actually, the next few months and the next year, whether we make changes that are embedded or move to become embedded over time, and how we really see, Neville mentioned the fourth industrial revolution, the impacts of some of these, as well as the growing inequalities that will undoubtedly emerge because of the pandemic. I think it's in the next few months, the challenge is us to respond in a connected way and in a moral way, and in a way that's inclusive of a whole range of students with needs, some of who will be unemployed, who previously had jobs, and many of whom will need to change jobs. And that will, I think the next few weeks we'll really see, next few months, we'll really start to show how our institutions are interpreting that challenge. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The perspective from Glasgow, yeah. So probably I just have to sneak in by myself. So my name is Markus Reilen. In fact, I'm not anymore vice president of our university because I'm lucky. I'm currently on sabbatical, yeah. But I used to be vice president for the last 8 years for our graduate education. We also set up a teaching service for accreditation and for the topic of entrepreneurship and the industry university transfer. So what I would like to do today is a little bit zoom out a little bit more, yeah, because I was asking myself if we take a little bit the perspective broader from the day-to-day experience, including the hassles we have to go through. I'm not quite sure if you also had to go to engage in homeschooling of your children, which becomes then even more difficult. So you're trying to do your online teaching, and at the same time you have children you have to manage. Yeah, so then it becomes like a key problem. But if we abstract a little bit from this daily experience, then maybe one of the key lessons from COVID-19 is to embrace like an e-learning technology before the disaster strikes. Yeah, and I think that happens at Leuphana. So we were prepared a little bit, but not completely. So it struck the university, and then we had to prepare in a few weeks and to manage everything online. And today, I think we are forced to practice online teaching. Some actually started to like it. I actually also started to like it. And some actually hate this type of learning and teaching, including students, yeah, for good reasons. And I think many of these issues you already discussed. What I was just thinking about, so how do actually universities react to this, yeah? And probably whether COVID-19 is a game changer or not is probably not clear for all universities, or is like a usual academic answer is it depends, yeah? And I was just thinking about on what factors does it depend? And one issue that probably resonates with Andrea's point of view, because you're a sociologist, yeah? And one thing has to do with identity. So organizations as such as universities, they are constructed and maintained by systems of beliefs and values and power and control. And they may also engage in support or in resistance. So the way how universities basically see themselves, how they consider themselves, what is my identity? How do I consider when teaching excellence is actually in place, actually matters whether they like to engage in online teaching or whether this is not the case. And for the case of simplicity, I may just distinguish two types of identity. There's like a prospector identity, which is highly responsive to these changes in technology and trying to incorporate this into their own teaching, but perhaps also in research, and in this case is more adaptable to societal needs. But then we also have the defender identity. And defender identities are usually preoccupied with, let's say, more preserving the standards, the conventions, the norms from the past, because they're considered like, yes, that's how we have to do good education. And so the case of identity is actually like an old one. If we just recall how, for instance, some faculty members responded to the rise of massive open online courses, yeah. For instance, like back in 2013, professors in the philosophy department at San Jose State University were refusing to teach a philosophy course developed by edX, a massive open online platform. And they argued that they did not want to enable what they saw as a push to replace professors, dismantle departments, and provide a diminished education for students in public universities. If we take the more recent experience from Germany, and of course Andrea knows this, German university professors called for the cancellation of studies for the summer term as a response to COVID-19, to the COVID-19 crisis. So from an identity perspective, like moving online is not experienced by all as a great thing to do. And for some, it's actually rather considered as an identity threat, because it's undermining a person's self-belief as a teacher or as a good professor. And then, of course, it becomes a problem. And universities with a strong defender identity will experience much stronger patterns of reactance by the university faculty. And as a result, they are more likely to perceive moving into online teaching, not so much as an opportunity, that's great, what we should do, but rather perceiving it as a threat. And then they have to deal with much greater degrees of reactance. And this may be different like with the prospector identity, if we take it in these very simple terms, yeah? A second important driver, I think, whether universities are really adopting this type of technology has, of course, to do with technological capacity. Because identities also interact with technological capacity of universities. And this is, of course, reflected by what have we done over the last, let's say, a decade in terms of investments and experiments into technological, or into using digital teaching and learning. If we think about like MIT, so MIT started, I think, around like 2000 to engage in online learning. So they have like 20 years of experience. Or if we take the Open University in the UK, which is probably, but you have to correct me, the largest one in the UK, with something like 160 or 170,000 students, specialized, of course, in distance learning. And that, of course, gives you a certain push towards using this experience and then translating it into initiatives. But I know that Glasgow also has like a longer time or a past dependency in engaging with this. So these are, I think, two factors that actually play a role, whether universities are likely to engage in online teaching, taking it as an opportunity or rather as a threat. And if they take it as a threat, then they may just inch along and do what they are required to do. Yeah. But then there are probably different ways of how this technology may shape the higher education system. And one is what I may call like a sustaining innovation. Yeah. So a sustaining innovation is basically an improvement along some characteristics of our educational services. And in this case, education as we know it would be enriched, for instance, through blended learning, giving the experience with distance learning or open education, resources and online learning. We could see digital technology as an important way of improving and enhancing the previous trajectory that we have taken before. And there are some interesting new initiatives that emerged from the COVID-19 to sustain innovation, the sustain innovation scenario. And I think it resonates with what Maura said. There are more collaborative teaching efforts, so we can engage in global classrooms. So we can do it easily across different universities. We have the technology. You just have to connect people to do so. There has been an initiative by 7 German universities, and they basically designed a course on organizing in times of crisis. So all the resources are publicly available. So you can basically pick, integrate it. So things of collaboration across different universities and potentially creating joint courses is like a great opportunity to do so. Or of course, if you just manage your own seminar, you can actually have on every seminar session a different expert. So this is all possible now, but of course it also has restrictions, I think, as Neville and Andrea also were correctly pointing out. Then there's a second move, and that's what I may call transforming innovation, because digital learning may also transform education, perhaps in both quality and scale. Instead of using digital platforms to teach knowledge via some form of instruction, as we may use to do this, we can use digital platforms to create new knowledge in a collaborative fashion. The underlying mission then follows more the credo of education through co-creation, and knowledge is then actively generated through social interaction in these digital spaces. That works certainly better in some disciplines than in others. Yeah, so if you're studying and teaching music, you can basically engage in these co-creation platforms much easier than if you do medicine or if you teach chemistry, yeah, where you actually have to work with physical stuff. But here, so the underlying idea is you can use these platforms to facilitate problem-based learning, and not just back home, but you can actually orchestrate a global group of students and also a global group of experts that can actually work together on these issues. And perhaps we come back later to the World Health Organization. Maybe this is like an approach to solve a global problem. Yeah. And then there's a third response that may be a little bit unusual, and that's perhaps disrupting the field. Like a final scenario may look like this. So contrary to universities focused on distance learning, if we take the case of the Open University, which still keeps an academic staff for research and teaching, we can actually imagine, whether we like it or not, a new type of educational organization I may call the Hollow University, which is an institution of a very different kind. And Hollow Universities actually exploit two interdependent and mutually supporting trends. The first one is digitalization makes education globally available, and we can connect different people around the world. And the second has to do, of course, with accreditation of institutions, which helps to reduce the quality uncertainty for users. So these trends then also, of course, help to make the educational product more tradable, transferable, and combinable for educational degrees. A little bit what Maura also was suggesting, that makes things much easier to transfer credits across different programs. But what does it mean? And some are actually trying to strive on these trends, because it may also lead towards splitting up the educational value chain between those actors who actually are specialized in the production of education content and those who are actually combining it towards degrees. And classically, universities have been doing this. But if we take examples of perhaps the Hollow University that is on the rise, Coursera or Minverva are probably like examples that are moving into this new form of organization. And that can be, of course, universities will not like it, but I think it's probably going to happen because the massive open online world actually started to develop these platforms that actually have not necessarily a clear university base behind. So like these considerations are probably much more like a very rough brush strokes to sketch possible futures. Whether this is going to happen, I'm not quite sure, but I think this is something that is probably happening at the horizon. And then it's a matter of us, how we like it and how we deal with these issues. So, of course, there are no questions now because questions may arise later. Yeah, so let's then we actually would move to two participants that actually have an outside view. Yeah, so because they are not responsible for organizing higher education, but rather having an outside view. So maybe we just go to Cassie Haig, analyst on the creativity and critical thinking in the higher education project from the OECD. So Cassie, what's your outside view on digitalization and COVID-19?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. I'll do my best. I was also actually working myself in higher education until not very long ago, so I kind of straddle the two worlds. There's been so many thought-provoking contributions already, so I'm really looking forward to the discussion. As Marcus said, I work as an analyst in the Centre for Educational Research and Innovation, or CERI, in the OECD. And I work there on a project around fostering creativity and critical thinking in higher education. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about that project to explain on what basis I make my remarks, and then reflect very briefly, specifically on creativity and critical thinking in higher education post-COVID. So the project's an action research project. We work with practitioners who redesign course syllabi and develop and trial teaching and assessment practices that are really looking at supporting students to be critical and creative as part of the development of their subject knowledge. And then we develop those together and publish them, as well as developing professional development resources and rubrics and other materials. And we work with a network of 26 higher education institutions that kind of from across the globe, really. So from Portugal, Spain, UK, Ireland, Japan, China, Canada, Australia, Mexico, Russia, Finland. So not completely again, across the globe in OECD countries largely, so countries of higher incomes. And we work across disciplines. So we have a lot of people in medical sciences, animal welfare, and then we also work in teacher education, philosophy of science, to mention just a few. And at the moment, we meet with them monthly to kind of discuss their experiences of innovation in their teaching. So of course, since the COVID-19 crisis, the focus of many of our discussions have moved to how institutions are responding to the crisis, how they're managing it, and particularly how we can support creativity and critical thinking in online and hybrid modes of learning, and then how we can try to sustain that after the COVID-19 crisis. So in some ways, I think we can see this kind of pandemic as people have mentioned, as and the move to online as a sort of retreat from physical space, a disengagement from physical space and a move into the virtual world. But I think it's also really important to see this, as some have mentioned, as part of a re-engagement with issues of pedagogy, particularly in higher education. Of course, there are huge challenges and difficulties, and that's pushing universities and staff and students to their absolute limits. I think it's really important not to minimize those challenges, and I think that my fellow panelists have been really helpful in highlighting and exploring just some of those challenges. And certainly those are reflected in the experiences in our network as well. We've had anecdotal conversations about a range of critical issues with people, ranging from kind of digital burnout and digital overwhelm of both students and staff, access to resources, new nuances to the digital divide, which is obviously very much still with us. We've seen concerns about ensuring adequate funding in higher education, job security of staff, well-being of students and staff, all sorts of issues that are really speaking, I think, to the heart of questions about what the university is, what its purpose is, and what its future should be. But I do think that those challenges and that kind of current fluidity that we see at the moment in higher education space and time and structure do make even more visible the need for creativity and critical thinking. So certainly for our students, critically engaging with information and technologies and practices and sources and ideas has become really essential, and not just in a generic way, but in a way that requires quite developed subject knowledge in order to combat in-depth misinformation or participate in informed debates about the current moment and the context, create new ways of doing things. And as part of that large-scale questioning, I think there's a possibility that post-COVID we could see more opportunities to further embed creativity and critical thinking in higher education across disciplines. So it might be possible to use this kind of renewed focus on pedagogy that some of the other panelists have mentioned also, to identify practices that can augment and extend existing pedagogical models, so not necessarily replace them, but as I say, augment and extend them. So just as some basic examples, I think that the kind of independent self-directed work that students are often asked to do now as part of their online learning, as the asynchronous part of online learning, often involves students in problem-based learning, in projects, in kind of grappling with questions and problems that have multiple answers, that are open-ended. We often see students evaluating and curating content and sharing it with their peers, and playing a kind of active role in peer learning in that way. I think across our network we see more students involved in sometimes more continuous and multiple forms of assessment, so perhaps having more control and ownership over their assessment with the use of portfolios and discussion forums and other ways of making the learning more visible that's happening while students are online. And all of those are practices that also broadly support creativity and critical thinking, of course. I think it's important to remember that even that asynchronous self-directed learning that happens as a result of online learning still needs to be designed and structured and guided and supported by faculty and universities and curriculum frameworks. It still represents an intellectual exchange between faculty and students. So I don't think it makes the role of faculty or universities less important. I think it would perhaps be overly hasty to kind of be propelled by the current moment to make pronouncements that the future of higher education lies, you know, in the death of intellectual stimulation and exchange, or relations between people, or that everything's going to be online or completely fragmented. I think that those sustained relationships between people are going to continue to be really important, and hopefully that sense of intellectual stimulation and engagement, questioning assumptions, creating new ideas, can become a kind of even more embedded part of the education that we're offering post-COVID. So I think the current moment opens up multiple possible futures and paths for the future of higher education. It's almost like we're going through a massive action research project in which thousands, if not millions, of faculty are experimenting with putting their courses online. We don't know the results of that yet, so I don't think it's a moment to be uncritical. I think it's a really important moment for research and discussion and collaboration, such as what we're doing today, so that we can make sure that practitioners and scholars and institutional managers can really actively shape the future of higher education post-COVID-19, rather than just kind of respond to changes that feel imposed by the current conditions or the current kind of movement or situation. So I think that's all I wanted to say for now. Thank you.
I think there are some very helpful points for discussion later on, yeah? Critical thinking and relationship building, which is sometimes maybe more challenging in the digital space than in the physical space. Thank you very much. Then we have Ibadat Dillian, Technical Officer, Department for Health Workforce from the World Health Organization. And I'm very happy that you are here. So what better organization could we have when talking about COVID-19? Although you may not design the educational programs, but you are certainly one who would like to have greatly educated students. Is that right? You probably have to unmute yourself.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I have a few slides and I will go through them quickly. And please ignore the notes on the side, because I think that's for a different audience. But I will, what I really want to speak to today is how, looking at the issue of health professional education, international health worker mobility, can give effect to many of the things you've been discussing here around the issues around equity, global cooperation, and the role of universities. And with this, in this respect, I think it's useful to say some of the points made earlier about, in many low middle income countries, the lack of digital curricula, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of electricity, the lack of tools, equipment, such as laptops, smartphones, are a constraint on delivering education. So for example, just as a quick example, Nepal, Uganda, Sudan, and Nigeria, health professional education has been suspended for these last 8 months. So they have not been able to cope, right? And that has an impact not just on the countries we're talking about, it also has an impact on UK and Germany, who are increasingly reliant on health workers from these countries. And so this issue of the movement and migration of health workers, the education of health workers across borders is highly relevant in the context of COVID. So much so that just earlier today, the director from my department spoke to the German Bundestag, the subcommittee on global health, where again, it was his emphasis on the need for international cooperation, investment in education across borders, and employment of health workers across borders. Last week, similarly, in the UK, Andrew Mitchell, who is the former DFID secretary and current member of parliament, conservative member of parliament, has proposed a bill saying that we need to educate 2 people in developing countries for every 1 we recruit for our NHS. So this is not an abstract discussion around cooperation and the role universities have to play. Sorry, and quickly, next slide. And just say this idea, the first item is a 1973 resolution. And the title of the resolution was Reverse Transfer of Technology, linked to the international migration, the brain drain of health workers. And even in 50 years ago, developing countries in particular were calling on wealthier countries to support measures designed to encourage the absorption of trained personnel within developing countries. So even 50 years ago, there was clear understanding that we need to support the training and the employment of health workers so that they can meet the needs of poor countries. And fast forward 50 years, what many people are looking at the current situation around the health workforce, they have described it as a global scramble of health workers, as many wealthy countries have been affected, are easing the regulatory processes to allow the flows of health workers, providing priority pathways to citizenship or residency for health workers, exemptions from travel bans, and while many low-income countries are trying to now constrain the movement of their health workers, such as not giving certificates of good standing or refusing exit permits, again, which impacts universities in many different ways. But again, so this is the current context we are in. This is work we had done 2 years ago, two or 3 years ago in 2016, where unlike most other sectors, the health sector is increasingly creating jobs, so increasing economic demand, but most of that economic demand was projected to be in high and middle income countries, so the ability to hire, financially hire health workers, while the needs were most pronounced in low income countries. So there's a mismatch between where the biggest burden of disease lies and who has the money to be able to hire health workers. And even before COVID, we could see this inequity where the wealthy countries were more and more dependent on foreign health workers. So this is quickly from the European Union. 11% of all jobs in the European Union are in the health sector. Another 2 million because of aging is expected in the next few years. Germany, I think we know well that the need for elderly care, particularly in nursing and the care industry. But similarly in Japan, Norway, United Kingdom. It's significant, the shortages, and COVID has just brought it further to light. This slide I wanted to show simply because you can see that many people are working in a country different from where they were trained. So this is an increasingly important issue. So I think something to think about for universities, are we training for a global market or are we training for a local market and local need? And increasingly we can see that health professional education has globalized and it's training for a global market, but then the question arises, but what about the needs of the populations that are not able to afford the employment of these students? I think I already mentioned this about temporary mobility and regulatory flexibilities that are increasingly in play because of COVID. I think we will see in the long run how much flexibility is acceptable. Many clinical placement exams have been suspended because of COVID. I think later on we will find out how many of these were actually necessary and how many were excessive. So, and finally, I think the issue of internationalization of medical education is also an important one. I think we heard earlier about Chinese students studying in one of the universities. More and more we are seeing students moving to access and students moving with their own private resources and in many ways subsidizing the education systems in wealthy countries. For example, we often worry about the brain drain from the Eastern Europe to Western Europe, but we can also see from work we've done, for example, in Ireland, that less than half of the European medical school graduates who have EU nationality. that over half of the Indians and Nigerians in Ireland did not study in their country of origin, but rather studied in Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland. So students are coming with their private resources into the countries. For the first time, we see more people migrated to go to a university and then migrated on to, this is the United States. So medical education has really internationalized, but then it again begs the question, how do we ensure that the training in the countries and even within the countries, in the needs of the rural populations and the underserved populations, how do we train? How can universities collaborate better to provide training and support for these places and people? And I think COVID is just another example of how do we do this in a context where we do not have the infrastructure, the electricity, you know, so how do we set up these collaboration pathways? But they're more relevant than ever. But I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think you picked up some very important topics. And now, of course, we have the question time. Yeah. So there are, if the audience wants to place some questions, then you're free to do so. Until you found your questions, maybe I just place one. Yeah. Maybe I just pick up your question concerning your presentation. I think the question of regulatory framework is actually a very interesting one, because if I reflect the German experience, the German logic is we actually educate mainly local students for local jobs. And that's basically the finance model. So like Lower Saxony is educating, of course, one could say more like German students or European students, and you can actually study tuition free. And even if you come from abroad, but it's not completely embraced. How do you actually develop educational platforms to educate for a global market? That has not been on the political agenda. At least not in Germany, yeah? Of course, to some degree, because you can actually study without paying tuition. So in this case, it's inviting international students, but then of course, only to a certain degree, yeah? So there's a lit. How is this managed in the other countries? Of course, if we look at the UK has much more like a commercial model. So where you're basically financing the growth of university based on fees.
And I can tell you that I've also heard complaint from German government around the movement of German trained physicians, for example, to Switzerland, right? So it's because they have funded the education. And so similarly, many low-income country governments also complain because of that.
Yeah. But I think Germans would not really are in a good position to complain. If I just think about our Dutch partners, the University of Maastricht has 1/3 of the students that are Germans. And so in this regard, of course, they also have to pay a little tuition fees. So it's not completely free, but basically the Dutch are educating the Germans to some degree. And on the other hand, we don't see an equal export of Dutch students in German universities. But that's an interesting question, yeah? Who has an opinion to pick up this? And I think you made a good case with healthcare workers, yeah? That's a very good case and very important case. Because if we have this influx of healthcare workers from the developing world, what is our contribution in educating them? In integrating them? Especially during these times, yeah?
Marcus, I wonder if I could come in on that, because it has been a big question, certainly at the University of Glasgow for many years, with a big medical school. And in recent years, colleagues in biomedical sciences have led an initiative to open up a dental hospital and dental school in Malawi. And one of the reasons for that is precisely the concern that IBIDA identifies, that we bring these very bright young people to Europe, North America, Australia, and increasingly places like China, and then we keep them. We always say they're going to return in increased capacity. And so one of the things that we've done is to try and say, well, the only way you can increase capacity is increase capacity in country, and the ethical thing to do is find genuine forms of collaboration. But of course, they're incredibly difficult to fund. Nevertheless, I think we have to recognize that globalization has up to now been fairly a one-way street in terms of the benefits, and we do have to think in much more creative ways, and maybe some of the technologies will enhance those opportunities.
Can I maybe just add a little bit to what Jim has said there? I think one of the things that we did and others have done as well is going back to the MOOC comment. We have a number of MOOCs that we just made available for free. The content was free for whomever wished to access it. And I realise that doesn't remove the technical boundary, but where we have developed courses online, actually it's very easy to open them up. If we can do that and have that learning facilitated elsewhere by people who can support a local community that isn't necessarily close to the host institution. So I think some of what we're learning, and not everything requires very high level technology. Some of the technologies we've chosen to promote for use at the moment are ones which use the lowest broadband possible and that you can access offline. So it's not all about downloading expensive or large data files. So I think if we are building on what we're doing now, we could push ourselves to be creative. Jim is right about the funding model, it's challenging, but actually most of us have probably gone some distance in creating online materials that could be converted in. In Scotland, the Scottish Government are funding an upskilling initiative for Scottish employers, and we have waiting lists from healthcare workers for the courses we're offering from our medical college and from the business school. So, I think we have got, certainly we have, and I'm sure others have got models that if we go back to them and see what works, could we adapt them further and build the kinds of collaborations that Ibidat's talking about and Jim's pointing to.
Marcus, if I can maybe step in there, I think that there are clearly opportunities, burgeoning opportunities because of the shift to online and digital that Maura has mentioned there. I think one of the problems though remains the issue of language. So the UK is still stuck very much in an English Anglophone rut, and until just to take one example, my university is very strong in aquaculture. It's grown up with the Scottish salmon fishing industry, and aquaculture is what will produce a lot of the world's protein over the next 50 years. But the people we need to teach and support in that speak Indonesian. They speak various dialects in Nigeria. They speak Spanish and Portuguese down in Latin America. So there's still that issue of, I think, of the language to overcome. And I don't really think the British university sector, Scottish and British, is particularly in the right place to deal with this, because we've been so used to dealing in a monolingual environment. And I don't think our kind of regulatory QA, quality assurance mechanisms are sufficiently flexible for that to take place at scale. Things are changing, but I do think there's a job of work to do. It would be great, we do a lot of nursing. It would be great to teach nurses through online sources and so forth. But our regulatory environment still insists that our nurses have a very, very high level of English because they are put in placements in the local community. So there's lots of things to overcome, but where there's a will, there's a way, I'd hope.
Thank you. I would like to pick up perhaps some topics that emerged in the chat. I think there's one interesting question that was put up by Jan, building on Maura's point on connecting as a community. What best practices do you see in fostering student engagement with study programs? So I think this puts an important point that we may all face currently. So how do you actually build this type of connection and community building when we actually have no chance to see each other? And perhaps there are some practices where you think that actually work well. Is there something you would like to share where you could where we could basically deliver some of these best practices to the audience. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure I won't do my colleagues justice, because lots of them have come up with some very creative approaches, and I only know some of those, but I'll give you a few examples of what we've been trying, and some will work for some students and some won't. But particularly popular seems to be something called the lecture watch party, where colleagues are recording their lectures and segments, playing them with students, and then stopping and having a conversation about what they've just watched, and doing that for a period of time. And it builds up students' confidence to interact with each other. They use the chat functions, they use polling, they use virtual whiteboards. But that alone is not enough. And they've also been having informal, just scheduling a coffee session with them. So it's not a tutorial, it's just a time for students to meet. I think that's helpful, but I actually think some of it comes back to what Cassie was talking about, and she put it much better than I did, how we design the learning in the first place. I think if we build in asynchronous and synchronous group activities and some group assessment, actually students then have a reason to connect with one another and something purposeful to do, and friendships can come out of that. So I think there is a range across how we design the learning, and then also how we create opportunities for them to meet with one another, particularly when they are first year undergraduates and new to university. But having said all of that, we are still worried about, I mean, we've not done anything like this at this scale before, and we are still worried about students who didn't choose to study online. That wasn't what they intended, and they have lots of competing priorities, and I think it's still a work in progress, but it does require, I think, that the tutors they do have contact with to just go that extra step and organise those. We've had cinema nights, I think there's even been virtual yoga, just to get students to talk to each other and critique a film together and build those friendships from there. So they're just some of the examples I'm familiar with.
Thank you. Are there other examples you would like to share? Yeah, Cassie.
Well, just building on what Maura said, I think she already shared some great examples. I think, you know, one of the question was about interaction kind of outside of the virtual classroom, and I think, as Maura says, what you do within the virtual classroom can also help to support that interaction outside of the classroom. So you know, making use of small group work and breakout functions, and actually working with students to develop you know, tools for how they want to interact with each other, maybe mandating that they interact with each other kind of outside of the synchronous time as part of their work for the course, can all really help. But again, to echo what Maura said, I think the issue becomes this issue about digital burnout and overload. And when students have particularly heavy course loads and they're spending already a lot of time in front of the screen interacting with each other, it can sometimes feel difficult to increase that even more so. So there are all sorts of kind of challenges about finding the balance to make sure that students are having those opportunities to interact with each other, but they don't, you know, that they're also having opportunities to step away from the kind of online world.
In Lüneburg, we, at least in one study program I teach, we subdivided the whole group into small groups of 6 students, and then with like one mentor. And then they met on a regular basis on Zoom meetings. And then, of course, initially the idea was, you know, then you have a little bit like a small family. So you can also meet in bars, but of course now the bars are closed, so this is not possible. Yeah. And I know that some groups also started to interact, and then they met somewhere in the woods for a walk or something like this. But it is quite a challenge to develop this type of connection that if I take my daughter, she's just finished her bachelor, that's what she's missing most. Yeah, the connection, the physical connection with people. There is another question from Lena, and Lena was asking, as a student, I was wondering how we can make online teaching even more inclusive for disabled people so that everyone can participate. For example, would it be possible to always subtitle seminars? Have you had experience with inclusive seminars you would like to share? Very good question.
Perhaps I can
Yeah.
start with the answer. I think this is very important to make also inclusive teaching and learning, but to have subtitles, I think it's very expensive, and to do this, and for the teachers, it's very time consuming. And from my perspective as a vice president for study and learning, I got the impression that not only the students are challenged by this situation, but also the teachers. And it's all about time consuming things. And we have to find ways to find a balance between the expectations of the students and the teachers. And in Göttingen, it was very interesting that the teachers missed the students, but the students missed the students. It's asymmetric communication. And the other thing is, many people are used to get an answer in 1 hour at least, like by Amazon and so on, but we are not at Amazon, but we are at universities. And I think we have to learn new and other behavior conducts. In Germany, last time I heard the new word Netiquette. And I think we have to think about these things. And the other thing is, I think, is we are very used to find out if the person I meet face to face is friendly or not, and so on. But this is, I think we can learn this also online, but we have to learn it. And to find indicators, or this is a very friendly person or not.
This is a very good point. Maybe just one comment. We had last week a meeting that was with practitioner, and then there was one person from SAP, and then he said, what I'm actually missing most is all these meetings are pretty much the same. So they all get on whatever, Microsoft Teams or Zoom, yeah? And you always sit in your office. The only thing that changes is basically the faces, but everything else is the same. And then he said, so probably nobody is going to remember this meeting we have right now in 2 years' time, because there's nothing to remember, because there's no lasting impression. And then I just thought, yeah, that's probably true. So how do you actually rebuild some of the lasting impression, the context, the feeling, the physical space you usually actually also take into account when memorizing a meeting, while in the Zoom world, everything is very, very similar. It's flat, you know, and they're just exchanges of faces, but even the background is sometimes the same. Yeah? But maybe you have some thoughts how you can create this lasting creative impression that we don't forget this meeting here today. Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's an answer to your question, but it perhaps speaks to another of the questions that we have on the comments about how we can kind of support each other as higher educational practitioners, as well as how students can support each other. But while you were thinking, I was thinking of the EdCamp movement, and I think started in the United States for primary and secondary schools, where it's a kind of peer-based participatory form of professional development, where the agenda is created by the participants as they arrive, and now those are increasingly held online. And I think that kind of model where you have a more spontaneous interaction, where you're able to kind of come to a professional development opportunity, for example, with something that you want to discuss, and then connect with other people that are also interested in that area, and have exchanges, you know, that leave room for the unexpected, you know, that aren't ruled by an agenda or a schedule or a list of things that we want to get through. you know, much like in real life, I think those sorts of things can also really help to for us to remember Zoom meetings, and also for us to connect with each other and support each other.
Marcus, I wonder if I could respond to Cassie there, because I think this is a really important issue. Education isn't what happens in the curriculum. It's the serendipitous moments that emerge in the interstitial spaces. And that's one of the reasons that we shouldn't assume that the present emergency provides some kind of template for the future. The kinds of issues that Ibadat is talking about aren't going to be dealt with simply by, you know, putting things online. And I have a deep concern that those interstitial spaces will become themselves class-ridden, so that people who can afford to go to a university that already has a great deal of face-to-face contact, and will continue to do that because that's where people build up their cultural and social capital, never mind their intellectual capital. And if we think of the present moment as an opportunity for many, be very careful that it doesn't become an opportunity for the few to further stretch the cultural and social capital that they use. And I know many colleagues touched on this, but I'm very anxious that technology is seen as a solution to what is effectively an analog problem.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Yeah, so education should be also in fostering enlightenment. Yeah, but in how far is technology actually supporting this type of enlightenment, which may not always be the case. Yeah, and maybe it rather undermines this type of engagement with the material, in-depth engagement with the material. Perhaps, which also goes a little bit to Stephanie Brusberg's question. So do you have further suggestions for hands-on measures that university lecturers could take to support each other and their students? And we take Jim's comment also into account. Yeah. So how can we actually do it to really enhance education? I know, Cassie, of course, you gave some hints. Yeah. Maybe one thing that at least we try to do is, but that goes basically hand in hand with what Cassie said, community building. Yeah. So really you try to develop your community of like-minded professors and lecturers, and then you start learning from each other. That's usually the best way. But that the premise, of course, is that you openly discuss also problems and errors, yeah, and challenges, yeah. Because we never learn when we only present our best stories, yeah, our success stories. We actually learn when we talk about our failures, yeah, and our problems, yeah. And so that usually is one way that helps. We also developed what we call like the teaching service, so they can usually help us with technological issues. But when it comes to learning from each other, the peer learning is actually a strong mechanism, yeah.
Marcus, it's not directly addressing that question, but it's just picking up on the point that all these meetings are the same and therefore they're not memorable, and also the thought of sort of building a community. Of course, you know, I miss those serendipitous moments, or what I call kind of the photocopier moments. Yep. You know, if you want to know what's going on in a university, you know, stand by a photocopier and you'll find out. There's no point going to committee meetings. But at the same time, I think I've learned a lot about my colleagues over the last 8 months. You know, I now know a lot more about Jim's bookshelf and his working environment than you know before. And I know we're getting used eventually to put these fancy sort of corporate things backgrounds, but I do think that I've learned about my colleagues in a different way over the last 8 months that I didn't really get when I was working with them. At the same time, though, you know, universities are about communities of scholars, community of students, and it is. I do think it's one of the fundamental challenges to recreate this in a virtual place. And I think, and it's taken the discussion a little bit further away, but one of the real challenges, I think, particularly for Scottish universities, is this sense of place. the places, well, I think Scottish universities trade more on that than many other universities in the UK. It really matters that Stirling, is where it is with its loch and its castle and its atrocious weather. Likewise in St Andrews and likewise in Glasgow and Edinburgh and elsewhere. And it's very, very difficult. So we're recreating that in a virtual environment. And it's not, it is that the space, the sort of the crucible that is created in these learning environments. It's very, very special. And the danger, as Jim was saying, is that is available for the few rather than the many.
Mm. But this is a good point, because that's the physical thing, you perceive, you appreciate. I just remember like one of the biggest conferences for business professors was basically delayed for next year. And the main reason was that the University of Düsseldorf said, if we do it like online, nobody actually recognizes that it's in Düsseldorf. And that's true, because they just host the platform and nobody goes to Düsseldorf. So they will never see the university. They will never see the city. And in the end, of course, you don't remember that it was actually taking place in Düsseldorf.
Can I maybe say just a little comment, and picking up on Cassie's remark that this is like an action learning project for us all. I think a really important way of supporting colleagues is for us to be very open to the fact that we will have got things wrong, and that we've had to do everything so quickly, and they will have got things wrong. We all will, and that the most important thing is to learn from that and not feel that it was that somebody didn't try hard enough or didn't, that everyone is really doing their best. And you said at the start, Marcus, people are trying to educate their children at home. There are so many consequences for us all. We have caring responsibilities, all manner of things that are happening in life. And I agree that I think it's given us more awareness of what people are doing in their lives, but equally we should have more empathy with the fact that, as far as I can tell, everyone is doing their best, and some people are doing amazing things, and some people just keeping their teaching going is absolutely the best job that they can do. And we have to then be very supportive of that, recognise the pressures people are under, and just try and create environments where we are all honest about what we would do differently. That's us as leaders and everybody. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to create an environment where we value and we support people's well-being.
Thank you. There is one very interesting, I just looked into the questions, I think like Torben from Leuphana, so he's suggesting the student community. So if you have student communities in your university, so they may be also a great networking place for students, that they don't feel lonely. I think that's an important thing. And perhaps we as faculty members can also help them to get in contact, And Lena was, actually she was placing an important point for the WHO. So if you have a wish for Christmas, what would be the wish for Christmas? What can we do for you? Ibadat, it's for you. So you have a wish for the European universities. So what would be your wish for the European universities?
My wish would be for the European community to support the European universities in having stronger cooperation with African countries, because it's clear that Europe needs health workers. Europe will attract health workers. Europe might also start thinking about investing in health workers in their place of both the employment, the education, and actually the employment in their countries. But yes, we don't know if Christmas is coming this year or not, so I hope so.
But of course, the date will come, that for sure. And we can still place something under the Christmas tree, And I think this is a good thing to do so.
Santa will come. That's just...
Santa, yes. So we place it right in time on Santa's list, But I think from my perspective, that's not just from a utilitarian perspective that we may profit from this, but as an educator, it may be actually our obligation to help the world, And in this regard, it's and as we can see, of course, nowadays, usually the splitting up of regions that are rather focusing on themselves is not very helpful, especially when we deal with global problems like the pandemic or climate change. Yeah? And we can only deal with these issues by really coming together and tackling these problems together. And that requires that we're not just doing things for ourselves, but doing things also for the world.
I have a wish for Christmas too. I wish that we learned enough for the next pandemic. And I'm sure if we do not change our way of life in the global north, it will be there. And this, I think, or perhaps you have the same wish or can understand this.
So this may be because we are already in the overtime mode. So maybe Andrea just put the right topic, and of course the topic with the wish list for Santa, which may be the right thing to finish up. From my side, I would like to thank you very much. That was very thought-provoking, many very good ideas. At least I can take home, yeah, and try to put them a little bit more into action. And perhaps we can follow up on some of these issues that we couldn't discuss here, including exchanging further ideas, measures, good practices. And it's great to have Scotland and Lower Saxony together. And maybe next time we can actually meet in a physical place. Yeah. Jim, do you have any final comments?
No, just to say thank you very much, particularly to Cassie and Ibidat. We all have vested interests in this. Of course, they have different vested interests, but we share the same common goals to have both an educated and a technologically and technically proficient population, and that all of this improves the lives of the most vulnerable. This is often forgotten in so much of what
Yeah.
we do in day-to-day business. I thought it was a really interesting symposium. I do think that one of the things we should be looking at as we look to this Lower Saxony, Scotland funding regime is also thinking not just about cutting edge research in technology or science, although that's hugely important, but also how to think differently about really high quality education. And so we should be thinking about inviting projects and ideas and people to work together on developing new pedagogic models and new collaborations in teaching and learning as well as in research. But just to say, thanks very much for stepping in at the last moment, Marcus, much appreciated. And thank you all very much for your contributions. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
It has been a pleasure. And so all the best and stay healthy. Yeah?
Thank you so much for this interesting discussion. Now I'm having my double voice again. I'm sorry for that. We are going to have a coffee break now until 3 p.m. in Germany or 2 p.m. in Scotland. Thank you all again so much for our side for participating and contributing and bringing so many proposals also from a practical point of view as well as from the theoretical point of view. I think this was a very interesting discussion for all of us. So thank you and see you back again at 3 p.m. for our last panel for today.
Thank you.